I've put a lot of thought into what can be done with leftover cloth, without coming up with anything. Though my thinking had gone mostly to the outer cloths, the wool or the linen sorts of things. I hadn't even thought about what can be done with leftover lining. I'd had to make a copy of a Gucci hair tie, and it seems to use a small enough and convenient enough amount of cloth that it can be made with our leftovers. This can be a nice accessory for yourself or for your friends who are women. I don't know if your friends who aren't women would be interested in one, but maybe worth a try. This doesn't need to be a guide, so this practically functions as just the idea plus some dimensions to get you started. Nonetheless, this is my characteristic over-explanation, but you don't need to use all or any of the techniques that I lay out in this video. Starting with the shape that I need to cut, I will make this on paper first to best explain its dimensions. Starting with a long straight line that needs to be about 90 centimeters or 33 inches. I want to make a folded pattern, which means one of the edges is folded, giving me one less seam to sew. Therefore, I need to make another line 12 centimeters or 5 inches from the original. That's 5 centimeters or 2 inches for the width, and 2 centimeters or 1 inch for seam allowances. I am drawing the seam allowances and the fold line inside of the pattern. From my original straight, I'm measuring half an inch and then 2 inches, since I'm basically working in inches for this pattern. Otherwise, I would use 1 centimeter and then 5 centimeters. Starting at one end, I'm drawing a 45-degree line to the original parallel lines. This line only has to hit the fold line, then giving it a seam allowance on top of that line too. I use that point to measure the length of the pattern coming out to about 80 centimeters or 32 inches. At the other end, there is another 45-degree line, which should be parallel to the first one. This way the pattern ends up looking like the clip art of an arrow. Back at the first end, I need to make the arrow by making another line 90 degrees at the end to connect the long edges. Same thing on the other end. As is apparent, this isn't a sufficiently sized piece of paper. I'm using my leftovers, of course, to avoid waste, but I can make it work. Inside the second long line, I want to draw the seam allowances along that edge too. They don't carry a function except to tell everybody what the seam allowance is, but you may want to cut the pattern without seam allowance so that you have marked lines to follow instead of following the seam allowances. I fold it in half long ways just as an idea of how it could be used if you want to cut two pieces and seam it all the way around. If I wanted to seam all the way around, I would just have to add a seam allowance past the folded edge. I want notches in the middle, but I forgot about that. I'll come back to it. With my lining pieces, I don't have a single piece long enough, so I am piecing it with another scrap. Pressing the lining flat and the seam open, I can place the pattern onto it to start tracing around it. If I'd used lighter paper, I could have pinned it to the lining and cut around it instead of having to mess around with chalk on lining. The convenient thing with the necktie is that it's cut on the straight grain instead of the bias like ties and bow ties. Therefore, when I'm cutting lining for garments, I'm more likely to have enough left over for this. At this moment, I remembered that I wanted the notches in the middle, so I can leave a small opening in the stitching so that the tie can be turned right sides out. I've folded it in half and cut notches a couple of centimeters or 3/4 of an inch from the fold to give me about a 4 centimeter or 1.5 inch opening. Cutting the shape out, there's definitely some scrap, but there's a bit that's enough for some welts or bearers, so I'll keep that around. Though the problem always is that I'm accumulating leftovers faster than it can be used. Hence this video. This is some leftover shantung silk from a silk morning waistcoat. The scarf can be chalked straight onto the cloth depending on what the cloth is, so that's what I'm doing here. It's wide enough, and this time I'm chalking the stitch lines and the fold line. My ruler is 2 inches wide, or about 5 centimeters. I'm chalking up the middle of the cloth and then chalking up the other side of the ruler for the stitch line. Then the same thing at the ends. Make some arrows 45 degrees to the fold and stitch lines, both pointing in the same direction. The convenient thing about the shantung silk is that it's firm enough that it doesn't shift about when I'm trying to chalk on it. It's also silk and light enough to make the tie from it. For the same reasons, not shifting under the machine, forcing me to pin it in place. Since I have the stitch lines, I don't need to cut the seams down before it's machined. I'm leaving the excess there for the moment. The shantung needs notches marked around the middle as well to tell me where I want to stop stitching. Here I just made it 5 centimeters or a 2-inch gap. Folding them on the fold line down the middle. The lining one, I want to pin it over to help me out under the machine. It doesn't matter which side the stitching is started on. It happens that I'm starting machining towards the point with the seams on both sides. Bar tacking to begin, I want a generally smaller stitch length to sew the tie. At the point, it shouldn't be sewn in a point, but a small round should be put in it in order to fold it out most cleanly. A few millimeters, or a good eighth, before the point I stop, turn the cloth in the machine, do one stitch, turn, another stitch, turn, and so on until I'm back on the straight edge. There shouldn't be many stitches in the turn of this point because I don't want the finish to be round. It still needs to be somewhat pointed, or at least that's what I'm going for. It's also easier when the stitch is marked onto the cloth and that is being followed instead of having to use the seam allowance and gauge it by eye, as I will do with the shantung. Between the pins, I want the raw edges definitely even, so that when the tie comes out, an even width later. Between the pins, I want the raw edges definitely even, so that the tie comes out an even width later. At the middle, it needs to be back-tacked and the little gap skipped over. Back-tacked to start a new stitch and carry on. At the other end, the point can just be sewn to and then turned without stitching a small curve into it. Same thing with the point on the fold. Since there's only one seam allowance, it's much easier to turn that through into a point. It just needs to be back-tacked and ideally the stitch run off of the cloth. With the other one, same thing. I'm starting from the opposite side this time, by chance, and the stitch line is chalked on, so it's just a little different but the exact same idea and stitching. Sewing the pointed end with the seam allowances on both sides is the same. Like I say, a little easier with the stitch line drawn on. I didn't want to draw a curve to follow, because that would be very difficult, but knowing exactly how far I am from the point and where I need to go back to get back onto the seam to start sewing again makes this much more easy. Back-tacking at the end. Aside from an initial press and cutting away some of the significant excess from the shantung, in order to fold it out neatly, the edges can be ironed over the stitching. The stitching should be on the edge or folded over with the seam allowance by a small amount and the edge ironed down firmly. This should be done along all of the stitching and across the gap in the middle. Having pressed the edges, the corners need to be trimmed down, especially where the point has two seams. That portion needs to be trimmed down the most to avoid having too many overlapping layers. It's important not to get too close to the stitching, but to be as close as possible because there is so much cloth being folded into that tiny area, much like making peak lapels on jackets. Similarly, at the same point on the fold and at the obtuse angle, though to a lesser extent and importance, but still should not be skipped. The seams folded over aren't overlapping, which means they won't start stacking on top of each other when the seams are folded right side out. Give it another press since the creasing wasn't totally cemented in place. Also, as a note to avoid pressing the long folded edge. It doesn't really matter, but it doesn't need to be pressed since when it's turned right side out, it's getting pressed the other way. Other tie, same thing, it's just a little more difficult to see since the thread is a bit more tonal. The excess at the corners can be cut down before the edges are folded. Another convenient thing about the silk is how durable the silk is, so I can practically just leave the iron there. What could also be done is cutting down all of the seam allowances to quite close to the stitching. If the cloth you're using is a little more translucent and the seams are visible, then it can appear neater with all smaller seam allowances, though mine are both opaque, so no need. With my pointed end tweezers, I can grip the very ends of the pointed corner to push it into the cloth. With the lining, it's easy to separate the layers and push the point inside, pushing it towards the opening. After the point is inside, you could use a blunt implement such as a knitting needle or chopstick to push it towards the gap in the stitching. I couldn't be bothered to go and get my chopstick. I continued gripping the point until it was through the gap, pulling the scarf fully right side out. Short story short, I tried doing the exact same thing with the shantung, but since the cloth is more rough, I couldn't easily separate the layers in order to push the point inwards with the tweezers. I had to put my finger into the gap, get it up to the point where I'm trying to tweeze, and then push the point into my finger to get the point to the inside. Pushing the point out, I don't want to push it with anything sharp, so I just used the other end of my tweezers. The tweezer end of the tweezers was going to be too sharp, and I expected it would much more easily break the weave or the stitch in the point. Last thing to getting a good point is using a needle to hook the stitching towards the edge and easing the stitching all the way out. I prefer a needle instead of a pin because it's easier to control with a thimble than a pin because a pin won't get into the dimples of the thimble. And you need to be using the pulling on the thread rather than the weave of the cloth, because the weave of the cloth, it's not got much going on, especially towards the points, so it's very easy to pull it out and you end up with raw threads, raw pieces of yarn sticking out. The rest of the seams and the other less acute points don't need as much work, and the seam can be rubbed and squeezed to the very edge. The scarf can be ironed flat, making sure as we go that the seams are still basically along the edge. The fold of the cloth also needs to be ironed at this stage. At this point, it's basically finished. The hole is still open though. That said, the Gucci one I copied was also left open. They just sewed the label there to kinda hold the gap closed. Like I say, it could be left open, it could be top stitched under the machine, though I'd much prefer to hand stitch it closed. I start the stitch inside of the gap and prick stitch across the edge, trying to keep the folds level. At the end of the gap, I can make a few stitches in the same place to use friction to keep the thread secure, hiding the thread between the layers of the cloth to cut it off cleanly, finishing the stitch. Same on the other one. All finished, I just have a look at the edges. I think I did quite well. And that is it for this video to give you something to do with leftover lining or cloth. Like the video if you liked the video or learned anything. Dislike if you didn't like the video or didn't learn anything. Find me on Instagram, MakerTube, and YouTube. Have a pleasant day.